Well, hello again, Faith Family, and thanks for taking time to join us for the Daily Connection. You know, it's a time when we get together in the Word, and more importantly, the Word gets into us. So this week, we're looking at Philippians chapter 4. Brother Aaron kicked us off yesterday with verse 15, and we're talking about being all-sufficient in Christ. And today, we're going to focus in on verse 16, but I'm going to go back and read 15 so that together they flow, because much of what we're looking at this week has a natural flow to be together. So look back with me in 15, and then we'll focus on 16. Paul says there, "And you Philippians know that in the early days of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you alone. For even in Thessaloniki, you sent gifts for my need several times." So obviously this is an area in which, of course, Paul had a place in his heart for the church at Philippi anyway, but this is an area specifically where it just really touched his heart, how they showed a genuine love for him, and more important, they showed a commitment to the gospel ministry. Now what's fascinating is so we know from Acts 16, specifically verses 39 and 40, that following the Philippian jail miracle, the magistrates came to Paul and Silas and the rest of their companions, asked them to leave town. Well, they went back and they encouraged the believers, and then they left. Well, what they did is they went about 95 miles or so south down the peninsula. The Nacian Way is what it's called, to a town called Thessaloniki. Now Thessaloniki was basically, although Philippi was kind of a main city of Macedonia, Thessaloniki was the much more affluent, much more financially stable, which is ironic because here Paul is acknowledging, and of course in his letter to the church at Thessaloniki, he notes that, hey, I worked so that I wouldn't be a financial burden to you, and on top of that, the brothers and sisters from Philippi sent down financial support to me as well, so that I would not be a financial burden to you. The one city that had the means, Paul said, I didn't want to be a burden to you, and they did not get involved, as far as we know, in supporting his ministry. But yet we see here that he says, even in Thessaloniki. So he's saying right out of the gate, just days possibly after leaving you, and maybe just weeks or so after the church was being established in Philippi, you immediately became involved in supporting me. You immediately sensed the call of God in your heart to make a financial contribution to sustain this ministry. Of course, now we do have Lydia, or the lady known as Lydia in Philippi, who would have been a lady of means. So there are some possibly in the church that could have done that, but that's not the point. The point is not that they had the means. The point is that they had a passion for the ministry. And that passion went directly to their pocketbook. It went directly to their financial stability or their financial means to give. And Paul says, not just once did you do that, but you did it several times. In fact, and I want us to look at this together. If we were to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul there, in something of a bit of a chastisement against the church at Corinth, says this to them: "We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." So just to kind of translate that, he's saying that although they were experiencing tremendous persecution, and although they really had very little means financially to do so, they did it not just in a base minimum. They did it, he said, in an abundant overflow of wealth of generosity. He said, and I can testify that according to their ability and even beyond their ability, verse 3 of 2 Corinthians 8, of their own accord, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints, and not just as we had hoped. And so here Paul is saying this wasn't something that we provoked from them. This wasn't me sending a letter to them and chastising them. And this wasn't me, trying to encourage them, doing some sort of a capital campaign. Paul says, no. In fact, they're the ones who messaged us first and begged us for the opportunity to participate in the ministry through the giving of financial gift support. And Paul says, hey, and not just as we had hoped, but here's the key. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by the will of God, by God's will. So there it is, friends. When it comes to generosity, when it comes to being financially involved, surrendering your time, surrendering your talent, all the other things that God has blessed us with that He expects us to invest back into His gospel ministry, we must first find our sufficiency in Christ. He must be our magnificent obsession, so that we're not distracted with things. We're not distracted with our own personal time. We're not distracted with our own personal accomplishments. Instead, everything we do is focused toward and is rooted in our relationship to Christ. And that's exactly what he's saying here in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And I just want to encourage you later maybe to take a deeper read of that, because it's a very challenging text. But when we come back here to Philippians 4:16, just to remind you what Paul says here. They didn't just do it once. They did it several times. Why? Because their heart was totally and completely in love with Christ. And they knew that Paul's ministry was to guide others to the same place through the preaching of the gospel and the making of disciples. So one of the questions that our writer asks is in what specific ways are Christians today called to be generous? I'm not really sure why it was posed as Christians today, because for me, it's in what ways are we called to be generous? And my response to that is simply this. What resources has God given you? Because if it's a resource given to you by God, then that means that we should honor Him in surrendering back to Him as much of that resource as we are led by Him to give. You know my heart. I'm not the one to get stuck on that 10th idea. For some, that's a challenge. For others of you, the challenge left you years ago, and you should be giving more of 20-30%. Let's don't get caught on percentages. Let's get caught on loving Christ completely and surrendering everything He has given us, because every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father. And let's get caught up in surrendering back to Him the gifts, whether it's our time, whether it's the talents, being number one, natural talents, number two, spiritual gifts and talents, or our finances, and you can go beyond that. Just fill in the blanks there. They're all gifts given to us by God, not to be selfishly utilizing our own personal gains or ambitions. No, to be focused toward His gospel ministry. And to come back to our title today, when we find our sufficiency in Christ, everything then becomes a means by which we are glorifying Him and finding more satisfaction in Him. And more importantly, we're making others aware of Him. So I hope this word encourages today. I hope this word challenges today. Challenges you in how you are giving and how you're surrendering back, and what that says about your sufficiency in Christ. Love you, faith family. Until we're together again, live sent.